The sun rose over the Gulf of Mexico with a pale orange haze the morning the MV Palmera departed. It was the 17th of June, 1987, and the port of Galveston buzzed with families, couples, and retirees boarding the cruise liner for a 10-day journey through the Western Caribbean. Among them were Lena Morris and Tyler Reed, newlyweds from Mesa, Arizona, both 29 years old, both wide-eyed with that unmistakable mix of exhaustion and joy that follows a wedding. They'd married just 4 days earlier in a modest chapel ceremony attended by only close friends and relatives. The cruise was a wedding gift from Lena's aunt, who had worked in the travel industry and pulled strings to book them a suite with an ocean view. Neither Lena nor Tyler had ever left the continental US before. This was supposed to be their adventure, the first of many. Lena was a nurse, the kind who always kept a first aid kit in her bag and wrote thank you notes to people who didn't expect them. Tyler taught high school history and played the guitar poorly but enthusiastically. They'd met at a friend's barbecue 3 years earlier. By the second date, they were already finishing each other's stories. Their cabin, C-204, was located on the upper deck, starboard side, not large, but airy and clean. The decor was beige and outdated, but Lena didn't care. She snapped photos of everything, the bedspread, the tiny soaps, Tyler making a face in the mirror. She kept her Canon SureShot camera on a wrist strap, never setting it down. According to multiple passengers, the couple was seen throughout the first few days of the voyage, laughing during trivia night, sunbathing by the aft pool, slow dancing near the string quartet during the captain's reception. Lena was described as outgoing, quick to compliment strangers. Tyler was more reserved, often letting her do the talking while he stood just behind her, smiling. On the third night of the cruise, the 20th of June, they dined at the Coral Table, one of the ship's 2 formal restaurants. They sat alone at a table for 2, dressed neatly, Lena in a pale blue dress with a thin gold chain, Tyler in a navy blazer that didn't quite fit. A server recalled that they stayed long after dessert, sipping drinks and talking softly, heads close together. It would be the last confirmed sighting of them. The following morning, housekeeping arrived at C-204 around 9:15 a.m. The do not disturb sign was still on the handle, but by protocol, the attendant knocked twice before unlocking the door. What she found was odd. The bed looked untouched. The sheets were crisp. 2 mugs of unfinished tea sat on the windowsill. One of Lena's earrings was on the floor beneath the nightstand. Their luggage remained unpacked. The closet door was open, half of Tyler's shirts still folded inside. The camera was missing. So were both of their shoes. At first, there was no panic. The ship had docked early that morning in Roatan, Honduras, and most passengers had disembarked quickly. It was assumed the newlyweds had simply gone ashore early. But by late afternoon, when the gangway closed and all guests were checked back in, the names Morris and Reed were the only ones unaccounted for. They hadn't signed out for any excursions, their ID cards hadn't been scanned on or off the ship, they hadn't used their room key since 11:38 p.m. the night before. The captain was alerted. A full search of the ship was initiated just after 6 p.m., first in public areas, then restricted ones. Crew quarters, storage rooms, medical facilities. The engine room. No sign, no disturbance, no alarms. By nightfall, the captain had notified the Honduran Coast Guard, filed a report with the U.S. consulate, and contacted the families back in Arizona. The honeymooners were gone. Word of the disappearance spread quickly among the passengers the next morning. By breakfast, rumors had replaced small talk. Some said the couple had eloped further inland. Others claimed they were spotted near the lifeboats late at night. But no one could say anything for certain. And the crew, following protocol, said even less. By the 22nd of June, the MV Palmera had left Roatan and was en route to Cozumel, Mexico. The captain, Gerald Niles, had already filed a formal incident report with Interpol and U.S. maritime authorities. The FBI was notified, though the agency would only become directly involved once the ship returned to American waters. In the meantime, The investigation fell to the ship's internal security team and a handful of local port officials, none of whom had jurisdiction past the dock. A second, more aggressive search was launched on board, room by room. Ducts, kitchen storage, supply closets, crew bathrooms, even the ballast tanks were visually inspected. Divers checked the waterline again. A helicopter flew along the return path to Roatan, but the water was flat and empty. There were no signs of struggle in the cabin. No damage, no blood. No fingerprints beyond those expected. By all appearances, nothing had happened, and yet 2 people were gone. Tyler's wallet was found sealed inside the cabin, safe, untouched. Lena's small toiletry bag sat on the bathroom counter, her travel toothpaste still capped. The most notable absence was the Canon camera, which had last been seen by a bartender 3 nights prior, dangling from her wrist while she leaned over the railing to photograph the sunset. The security log showed no keycard access to any restricted areas that night. No emergency doors opened, no maintenance hatches triggered. The Palmera was an older vessel, but well maintained. Nothing in the digital logs suggested a malfunction, and nothing in the analog logs, the crew journals, mentioned anything strange beyond one vague note. 3:10 a.m., thud heard below port hallway, presumed freight shift. The note had been made by a junior deckhand, who later admitted he hadn't investigated. At the time, he believed a cargo bin had tipped over during repositioning, but nothing had moved. And he wasn't entirely sure where the sound had come from. In the days that followed, every passenger who had interacted with the couple was interviewed. Cabin neighbors recalled the pair as polite and quiet. A group of college students said Tyler had helped them pick up spilled cards during game night. A cruise photographer remembered Lena asking if they could purchase extra copies of their deck photo. But no one saw them after dinner on the 20th of June. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no motives. By the time the ship docked back in Galveston on the 27th of June, the tone had shifted from urgency to resignation. The Palmera's public relations team released a short statement expressing deep concern and sympathy. The FBI boarded the ship that afternoon and collected surveillance tapes, scanned passenger lists, and secured access to internal logs. Every member of the crew was interviewed. Again, nothing changed. Back in Arizona, Lena's parents, Harold and Jean Morris, held a press conference on their lawn. Jean could barely speak. Harold did all the talking, a retired school principal with trembling hands and dry eyes. He begged the media not to turn it into a cruise ship mystery. He called his daughter careful, measured, not impulsive. Not the type to take risks. Tyler's older brother, Sam Reed, flew to Texas the next day. He demanded access to the ship. He wasn't allowed aboard, but he stood at the port for 3 hours, staring up at the hull. When asked what he hoped to find, he just shook his head and said, anything, a shadow, a crack in a story, a reason. But there wasn't one. No ransom demand, no credit card activity, no bodies, no answers, just silence. By mid-July 1987, just 3 weeks after the disappearance of Lena Morris and Tyler Reed, the story had already begun slipping from the headlines. There was no crime scene to investigate, no body to examine, no security footage to analyze. The FBI's involvement was technically limited. The ship was in international waters when the couple vanished, and no laws had clearly been broken. A file was opened, notes were taken, and the case was quietly marked, unresolved, under review. Behind closed doors, the families were unraveling. Harold Morris spent his afternoons writing letters to journalists, senators, ship inspectors, anyone who might listen. Jean stopped opening the curtains. She left Lena's room untouched, the bed still made, a wedding invitation pinned to the corkboard. Tyler's brother Sam, meanwhile, hired a private investigator. He paid him with the money he'd saved for graduate school. The investigator, Ray Coleman, was a former detective from Pima County who had transitioned into missing persons work. He was methodical, skeptical, and not easily impressed. He flew to Roatan in August and walked the docks where the Palmera had berthed. He spoke with local vendors, souvenir sellers, harbor police. No one remembered seeing an American couple matching their description. He checked shoreline logs, customs entries, nearby hotels. There was nothing. Back in the US, he examined the crew. The Palmera had operated with a roster of 137 full-time personnel, plus 46 contracted workers for cleaning, food service, and technical maintenance. Of those 183 individuals, more than half had rotated off the ship within a month of the Hale's disappearance. Coleman managed to contact two of them. Most were cooperative, a few evasive, none helpful. But one housekeeper, Myrna Vasquez, who had worked Deck C during the summer of 2087, told him something unusual. She remembered a warning given to all cleaning staff early in the voyage. Stay away from the engineering corridor after midnight, unless scheduled. At the time, she assumed it was for safety piping, wiring, or possible water hazards. But when she tried to clarify, her supervisor told her simply, "Some people don't like to be watched." Coleman noted it, followed up, and hit a wall. The cleaning supervisor had left the cruise industry 2 years earlier and moved back to Portugal. Myrna, who no longer worked at sea, admitted she hadn't thought of it since. But her testimony was the first to suggest that not every part of the ship was as accessible or as monitored as passengers were led to believe. Meanwhile, the FBI's internal review uncovered a small detail in the maintenance logs that had been missed in the initial search. On the night of the 20th of June, a technician named R. Delgado had logged a manual override for hatch C7, a maintenance access point near the stern of the ship, rarely used, typically locked, and not connected to guest routes. The override had occurred at 11:53 p.m., 15 minutes after Tyler and Lena had last used their cabin key. The technician claimed it had been a misentry, a system glitch, but the ship's logs showed no prior overrides in that area for the entire voyage. Delgado was never charged. He was never even formally questioned. He had rotated off 2 weeks later and disappeared into another job on a vessel in Europe. No forwarding contact, no forwarding address. In September, Coleman submitted his findings, such as they were to the FBI and the families. They amounted to nothing conclusive. A door was opened. No one saw who opened it. A couple disappeared. No one saw them leave. That fall, Lena's aunt closed her travel agency. She said she couldn't, in good conscience, book people on ships anymore. Jean Morris began attending a support group for families of the missing. She didn't speak during the first 3 meetings. On the 4th, she brought a copy of the last photograph Lena had mailed her, the two of them standing in front of a mural in Galveston, both holding ice cream, grinning like kids. "We thought it was going to be the best thing that ever happened to them," she whispered. "We were all so sure." But by the end of 1987, with no new leads, no witnesses, and no evidence, the case of Lena and Tyler was quietly placed in a filing cabinet in a windowless office in Houston, labeled with a 4-digit code and a red sticker that simply read, "Unsolved." It would be nearly a decade before their names were spoken again outside of family circles. For years, the file remained untouched. Occasionally, a new agent would skim it, hoping for a connection to another case, a pattern, a suspect, anything. But the disappearances of Lena Morris and Tyler Reed faded into the long shadow of unsolved cruise mysteries filed somewhere between bureaucracy and bad luck, until the 6th of April, 1996. On the northern edge of Isla de la Juventud, a remote island off the southern coast of Cuba, a small group of local divers were scavenging the coastline after a storm had passed through days earlier. The beach was littered with debris, plastic bottles, broken fishing gear, seaweed, the usual aftermath of heavy current and open ocean. But among the tangle, one of the divers, Orlando Mendez, spotted something wedged under a rock ledge near the shallows. A badly decayed blue canvas duffel bag, half buried in sand and coral. The zipper was frozen shut with salt and rust, but the bag still held its shape. It took 2 men to pull it free, and when they finally pried it open, they found something that didn't belong to the sea. Inside were 2 faded US passports, a woman's compact Canon camera, a ruined spiral-bound notebook, and a small jewelry pouch containing a gold chain and a wedding ring. The names on the passports were clear: Morris, Lena, Reed, Tyler. The discovery was reported to local authorities in Nueva Gerona. From there, word made its way to the U.S. interest section in Havana, the closest equivalent to an embassy at the time. Within a week, the bag and all contents were flown to Quantico, Virginia, where the FBI's evidence response team began processing it under a sealed case file. The bag had been soaked for years. The paper was warped and stained. Most of the notebook's pages had dissolved into unreadable pulp. The wedding ring was confirmed to match the description Lena's mother had provided in 1987. The camera, remarkably, still contained a roll of 35mm film sealed inside its metal case. Developing it took weeks. The film had been exposed to years of moisture and temperature fluctuations, and much of it was unrecoverable. But after multiple chemical treatments and digital scans, 4 images were partially salvaged. The first was a blurry photo of Lena sitting at the edge of the pool on the ship, her legs in the water, hair pulled back, smiling at someone out of frame. The second showed a nighttime view of the open ocean from the deck waves, illuminated by the reflection of lights from the ship's railings. The third image was more unusual. It showed Tyler, seated alone at a dinner table, holding a wine glass and looking off to the side. In the background, almost obscured by a lighting flare, was a man in a white maintenance uniform, standing near a closed door along the outer deck. His face was barely visible, but enough to notice a scar over his right eyebrow. And then came the fourth. The image was dark, lit only by what looked like emergency lights along the floor. Lena and Tyler stood close together, looking straight into the camera. Behind them, partially ajar, was what appeared to be a metal hatch leading into a narrow corridor. The sea was visible in the background. A handrail behind them was bent at an unnatural angle. The timestamp: the 20th of June, 11:50 p.m., 15 minutes before they vanished. The photographs were enough to reopen the case. In May of 1996, the FBI assigned Special Agent Dana Rourke, a 14-year veteran with a background in maritime disappearances, to the newly reclassified investigation. She was given access to the original case files, now yellowed and incomplete, along with the newly recovered evidence from Cuba. Her first move was straightforward: identify the man in the background of the third photo, the one in the white uniform with the scar. He wasn't listed in any of the official crew manifests from the MV Palmera's 1,987 voyage, nor was his uniform consistent with those worn by full-time ship staff. The cleaning crew wore light gray. The engineering crew wore navy. But this uniform white with orange piping was unfamiliar. Rourke requested archive staffing contracts from Blue Horizon Services, the third-party vendor that had supplied supplemental maintenance workers to the Palmera that summer. It took weeks to locate the records. The company had gone bankrupt in 1993, and their files had been absorbed into a warehouse of dissolved accounts. Eventually, she found what she was looking for: a subcontractor listed only by last name. A. Marquez. Nationality: Colombian. Position: after-hours maintenance support. Duration: 3 months. Assigned ship: MV Palmera. Supervisor: unknown. No social security number, no photo, no forward address, just a payroll stub and a signature. Rourke ran the name through Interpol. There were no active warrants, but a sealed record from 1984 flagged Marquez in relation to a missing person investigation on a ferry operating between Barranquilla and Aruba, a case that had never been solved. The report, written in Spanish, was sparse, but mentioned that Marquez had been dismissed quietly after a woman reported him for inappropriate conduct in a restricted deck corridor. He was never charged. 3 weeks later, the woman, a Canadian tourist, vanished from the ferry during its overnight leg. Marquez was never seen again after 1988. Back in the US, Agent Rourke reached out to surviving members of the Palmera's 1,987 crew. Many had long retired, others had changed industries, and a few had passed away. but a handful responded. One of them, Eduardo Dimas, had been a junior steward at the time. When shown the enhanced photo of the man in the uniform, he squinted, leaned closer, and said, without hesitation, "That's Andres. Andres Marquez. We called him Phantasma the Ghost, always working when no one else was around. Never smiled, always watching." Dimas also recalled an incident the night before the couple vanished. Around midnight, he had been returning from delivering ice to the casino bar when he saw Marquez standing alone in the hallway near the engineering hatch on Deck C. The area was restricted, no passengers were allowed there, and even most crew avoided it. Dimas remembered something else too. He looked nervous. He kept glancing toward the outer door. "I didn't say anything. We weren't supposed to question the contractors." Agent Rourke took that as a lead, the first real one in nearly a decade. She began working backward from the final photo, the bent railing, the hatch, the corridor. She cross-referenced the angle of the photo with archived blueprints of the MV Palmera, which, thankfully, still existed through maritime insurance records stored in Lloyd's of London. Using the curvature of the wall, the light fixtures, and the hatch markings, Rourke and a digital reconstruction team narrowed it down. The location in the image was a discharge corridor, an external maintenance path used to access a sealed gray water system that expelled waste from the lower engineering decks. The hatch behind them didn't lead to another part of the ship. It led directly to the open sea. For Agent Rourke, the implications were chilling. If Lena and Tyler had been near that hatch, whether voluntarily or under duress, and it had been opened, they could have been swept into the ocean in seconds. There would have been no splash heard on the upper decks, no alarm triggered, just darkness, current, and silence. She contacted Dr. Miguel Anaya, a senior oceanographer at the NOAA specializing in drift patterns and maritime debris modeling. Using weather data from June 1987, satellite current mapping, and known storm systems of that month, Dr. Anaya constructed a digital simulation. If, he proposed, an object like a duffel bag had been dropped overboard from the starboard side of the MV Palmera in the early morning hours of the 21st of June, it could have drifted south along the Yucatan Channel, then eastward, with the Caribbean Loop current curling around the Cuban archipelago before being caught in seasonal eddies off the coast of Isla de la Juventud. And if it got stuck, he said, beneath a coral shelf, inside wreckage, or wedged in reef rock, it could sit there for years, until a storm dislodges it. The model predicted that the bag found in April 1996 could have traveled that exact path. Its recovery wasn't random, it was timing and luck. But the bigger question was never the drift, it was how the bag got into the water. Agent Rourke returned to the internal logs of the MV Palmera. Hatch C7, the same one identified in the last photo, had been accessed at 11:53 p.m., the night of the disappearance, via a manual override. That override required a physical key. There was no digital unlock. No crew member had reported using the hatch. And yet, the lock system confirmed it had been disengaged from the inside for exactly 3 minutes and 24 seconds. 3 minutes. Enough time to open the hatch, dump a bag, or worse, and close it again. By mid-July 1996, Rourke submitted a formal request for a targeted underwater search in the zone where the Palmera had likely been sailing at the time of the override. The U.S. Navy denied the request. The area was outside their jurisdiction. The cruise company, long since rebranded, offered only nominal cooperation. But a private marine salvage company based in Belize, Coral Eye Recovery, agreed to help. They had recently acquired deep-sea drones equipped with sonar and low-light cameras. They worked independently, contracted only by private interests. On the 14th of August, after 12 days of scanning the seabed near the original 1,987 route, the drone team located something unexpected, resting at a depth of 198 feet, a metal locker with industrial markings. The logo, though barely visible through corrosion, matched the outdated branding of Blue Horizon Services, the contractor company tied to Andres Marquez. The locker was lifted carefully and brought to the surface. Inside were scattered debris, coiled cable, a broken flashlight, rusted gloves, but also something else. A sealed vacuum pouch. Inside it, perfectly preserved, was a plastic crew identification card. The name printed on it, Marquez A. Contracted staff summer 1987. Ship MV Palmera. It was the first physical confirmation that Marquez had been on board, that he had access, that he may have had something to hide, or that someone had wanted to hide him. The card had been wrapped, sealed, and weighted before being dumped. A deliberate act. Someone, at some point, had taken steps to erase him. The recovered ID card confirmed what had only been suspected. Andres Marquez had access, opportunity, and now motive. Whether he had acted alone or under orders remained uncertain, but his role in the story could no longer be dismissed as circumstantial. Interpol reissued a red notice under his name. No activity was found. No border crossings. No bank records. No taxes. The man had vanished from all known systems shortly after 1988. Either he was dead or someone had helped him disappear. But there was one more angle left to explore. Among the items recovered in Lena's duffel bag, the water-damaged notebook, once thought unreadable, had been sent through advanced forensic restoration. Most of its pages had dissolved. The ink melted into waves of black and blue, but one page, near the center of the spiral, was partially recoverable. Using hyperspectral imaging, technicians were able to lift fragments of ink from the faded pulp. One sentence emerged. He said, "We weren't supposed to be here. Tyler doesn't trust him." No date, no context, but enough to suggest something deeply wrong. Enough to hint at a warning. Agent Rourke reanalyzed the final photo, the one taken in the corridor, just before their disappearance. In it, Lena's face wasn't frightened, but tense, focused, as if she knew something wasn't right. Tyler's hand was placed protectively across her shoulder. Behind them, the hatch was open, the handrail bent. No water visible yet, but blackness, depth. From a structural diagram, Rourke determined the hatch in question was not only used for maintenance, but also gray water disposal waste discharge. The flow could be triggered manually by engineering staff. If opened, it could force water or anything else out into the ocean silently. It was the perfect place for something or someone to disappear. And yet, the investigation was still missing a voice, a witness, someone who knew Marquez. That voice arrived in September 1996 when an anonymous tip was phoned into the Miami field office. The caller identified himself only as Raul and claimed to have served aboard a Caribbean cruise ship in the 1982nd alongside Marquez. He had seen the photographs in a news article. He knew who the man was. "We all knew he wasn't just a cleaner," he said. "He had keys, real keys, and no one ever asked where he got them." Raul agreed to meet with FBI officials at a neutral location in San Jose, Costa Rica, where he had relocated under an assumed identity. He spoke carefully, nervously, never using his real name. But his recollections were sharp. According to him, Marquez had once been found inside a locked passenger corridor after hours with no assigned duties in that area. When confronted by another crew member, he claimed to be fixing something. But what struck Raul most was what happened next. There was no report, no formal complaint. The incident vanished. He knew things about the company, Raul said, about other crew members, things you weren't supposed to say out loud. Marquez, he claimed, had access to a ring of master keys, including those for emergency hatches, crew-only zones, and mechanical spaces. Keys reserved only for senior engineering officers. He could walk anywhere, and he did, but only at night. Raul's final warning was clear. If that couple ended up near that hatch, it wasn't by accident. He put them there, or led them there, or worse. With the mounting weight of testimony, photographs, forensic data, and deep-sea recovery, Agent Rourke submitted a renewed request to the U.S. Maritime Safety Commission. Her objective was now simple: Search the ship. Search the water below it. Find what's left. By October 1996, the MV Palmera no longer sailed under its original name. It had been sold in 1992 to a Singapore-based holding company, refitted, renamed the Sundown Iris, and reflagged under Liberia, a common move in the cruise industry to avoid regulatory oversight. It now offered short luxury routes along the South China Sea, its original layout modified, decks expanded, cabins refurbished. But not everything had changed. The ship's original blueprints, acquired by Agent Rourke from Lloyd's of London months earlier, revealed something overlooked in the original 1987 investigation. A sealed utility shaft beneath Deck C, running parallel to the corridor shown in Lena and Tyler's final photo. The shaft had connected the gray water discharge line with an external ventilation chute, used to relieve pressure during mechanical drainage. In theory, if that chute had been accessed or tampered with, it could have ejected a human body or two directly into the sea, bypassing main decks and avoiding surveillance entirely. No alarm, no splash, no witness. Agent Rourke filed a detailed proposal with the Maritime Recovery Commission, citing probable cause for a targeted subaquatic search, while the U.S. Navy again declined involvement, citing international boundaries. Private recovery firm Coral Eye, the same team that had located Marquez's ID, agreed to take on the mission. They would be working blind, using archived navigational telemetry from the Palmera's 1987 voyage, specifically the 20th of June 21st. Overnight window, Rourke and Coral Eye plotted an area of ocean where the ship had briefly slowed down between Roatan and Cozumel. The reason for the slowdown had never been logged. On the 3rd of November, Coral Eye deployed 2 underwater drones equipped with sonar, high-resolution cameras, and sample collectors. The sea floor in that region was difficult terrain. Uneven rock ledges, sediment drifts, and coral fields made scanning tedious. After 6 days of slow grid sweeps, something finally appeared. A metal frame rectangular, industrial, resting at a depth of 213 feet. Its shape matched diagrams of the engineering lockers used in older cruise vessels. It had no visible markings, but the hinges were identical to those used in Blue Horizon's standard issue units. The door was gone. The inside was mostly empty, except for one sealed pouch. Inside, a plastic crew keycard, corroded but still legible. The name A. Marquez. Designation, Auxiliary Maintenance Technician. Summer contract, 1,987. Authorized areas, engineering, ventilation access, lower deck control. The discovery was decisive. The keycard, like the ID badge found weeks earlier, had been sealed in a humidity-resistant vacuum pouch, a method rarely used outside industrial maritime operations. It wasn't lost. It had been hidden, intentionally discarded, and weighed down to disappear. But something had gone wrong. The locker hadn't sunk as intended. It had likely been caught in a current, drifted, then dropped, just like the duffel bag. And now, piece by piece, everything was surfacing again. Agent Rourke assembled the findings into a single report over 300 pages of timelines, diagrams, logs, witness interviews, and physical evidence. She submitted it to the Department of Maritime Enforcement under the title, Case number 874, Sea Coordinated Concealment and Probable Homicide aboard the MV Palmera. Still, one question remained. Where were the bodies? If the hatch had been used to dispose of Lena and Tyler, and if ocean currents hadn't scattered their remains beyond recovery, there was still a chance, however, slim, that something had settled in the deeper channels below. Clothing fibers, bone, a ring, something human. The search had to continue. The waters beneath the MV Palmera's last known course were deeper than most salvage zones. The shelf dropped steeply just past the Yucatan Basin, plunging into a network of undersea gullies and coral cliffs that rarely saw sunlight. Even Coral Eye's advanced drones struggled to maintain visibility more than a few feet ahead. The light was always fading. the pressure immense. But still, they kept scanning. On the evening of the 11th of November, a drone operator named Isaac Benitez noticed something irregular in the camera feed. It wasn't large, just a faint glint beneath a layer of silt near a narrow ledge, 227 feet below the surface. The team sent the drone closer, gently directing a current of pressurized water to disturb the sediment without damaging what lay beneath. What emerged first was the rubber sole of a shoe, white, brittle, but mostly intact. Just beside it, barely distinguishable in the murk, was the rusted ring of a camera lens. Both objects were carefully collected and brought to the surface the following morning. The shoe was a match. Photos from the cruise, including one recovered from the Canon camera found in Lena's bag, showed her wearing identical white Keds popular at the time, with a specific stitching pattern and sole tag. DNA analysis was slow, but trace fibers inside the lining yielded mitochondrial DNA, consistent with samples provided by Jean Morris, Lena's mother. The camera lens was confirmed to be a Canon 35mm lens, the same model that had been separated from the body of the camera recovered in Cuba. Most likely, it had broken off during impact with the sea or on the way down, torn loose as the body holding it was lost to the current. There were no bones, no clothing fragments, no personal effects, just two relics. Two undeniable signals in a void that had held its secrets for nearly a decade. For Agent Rourke, it was both breakthrough and heartbreak. She held a press briefing on the 4th of December, 1996, flanked by representatives from the Bureau and the Maritime Commission. She didn't offer sensationalism. There were no declarations of guilt, no dramatic language. But her words were final. We have located physical evidence directly linked to Lena Morris in the area where the ship slowed without explanation, near a hatch proven to be opened that night. The person identified as Andres Marquez had access to that hatch and has not been seen since the late 1982nd. We consider Lena and Tyler presumed deceased, and their deaths the result of intentional foul play. The cruise company declined to comment. Within 2 months, both families received quiet settlements, confidential, sealed, and bound by non-disclosure agreements. Neither Harold nor Jean ever spoke publicly about the amount. But in a short interview given to a local Arizona newspaper, Harold said this: "We didn't want money. We wanted a truth we could live with. I guess this is the closest we'll get." In private, Agent Rourke continued the search. With Coral Eye's help, a final wide radius sweep was planned, targeting the southern trench line beneath the drainage path. The operation was risky, equipment failures were frequent, and weather delays stalled progress for weeks. But on the 9th of January, 1997, one of the drones picked up an object partially embedded in the rock. A single gold earring, simple, circular, the clasp bent inward. It matched the one recovered in cabin C-204, the pair Lena had worn the night of the captain's dinner. It had sat on the sea floor for nearly 10 years. There was no doubt now. They hadn't left the ship willingly. They hadn't wandered off. And they certainly hadn't fallen. Following the recovery of Lena's earring, the final threads of the investigation began to settle into place. The FBI, now in full control of the case, compiled its findings into a classified report submitted to the Department of Transportation, the Maritime Safety Board, and Interpol. Internally, it was clear. The disappearance of Lena Morris and Tyler Reed was not an accident, not a mystery, and not a coincidence. It was a coordinated concealment. In March 1997, a joint task force formally ruled the case as probable homicide by unidentified individual S with maritime obstruction. It was a legal phrase designed to satisfy policy. But behind it stood a grim truth. 2 young people, on the first week of their marriage, had been killed at sea, likely thrown into the ocean by someone with both access and intent, and it had taken 10 years and a storm in the Caribbean to bring any part of them back. The cruise line never issued a public apology. Its new owners distanced themselves from the Palmera, now operating in Southeast Asia under an entirely different name, crew, and color scheme. But behind closed doors, lawyers worked quietly. Both families were issued sealed settlements. The Morris family declined all interview requests. The Reeds moved out of Arizona 6 months later. Only Sam Reed, Tyler's brother, agreed to speak to a local radio station. His voice was quiet, almost tired. "I think about them when I see wedding photos," he said, "or when I'm on a plane. That last picture, the one where they're standing in that corridor, that photo is in my wallet. Always has been." One last attempt was made to locate Andres Marquez. Interpol's red notice had turned up nothing. No aliases, no bank traces, no confirmed sightings. But in April 1997, an anonymous letter was mailed to the US Embassy in Bogota. Inside was no message, only a photocopy of a crew manifest from a different cruise ship, dated 1989, sailing under a Panamanian flag. In the margin, someone had circled a name: Antonio Morales, Deck Services. Agent Rourke reviewed the photo. There was no image attached, no verified connection to Marquez. But the initials AM, the timing, and the alias all matched the pattern of identity laundering common in contract shipping. Unfortunately, Morales, if that had been him, had also vanished after 1990. No more manifests, no employment records, no travel documents. It was like chasing a ghost. Rourke quietly closed the lead. By the end of 1997, the MV Palmera had officially been decommissioned. Its engine room gutted, cabins auctioned for parts, its outer hull rusting in a private ship graveyard off the coast of Indonesia. No memorial was held, no plaque mounted. To the public, the name meant nothing. But one photo remained. The final image on Lena's recovered film, the one of her and Tyler standing in the corridor, nervous, close. The open hatch behind them was never released to media. It was ruled too sensitive for publication. But Jean Morris requested a copy quietly through her legal counsel. She didn't want it for press. She wanted it for her mantle. The photo sits there still, in a small frame between two white candles. Every the 20th of June, she lights them both. They didn't disappear, she told a friend once. They were taken. But now at least they're not lost anymore. By early 1998, the Morris Reed case had become internal shorthand within the Bureau, a symbol of how maritime vanishings could occur in plain sight, shielded by jurisdictional fog and corporate silence. But Agent Rourke wasn't finished. After 10 years of scattered evidence and bureaucratic delays, she began reviewing other disappearances at sea between 1985 and 1992, looking for common threads. Similar ships, similar contractors, the same third-party staffing groups. What she uncovered wasn't a pattern, not exactly, but it wasn't nothing. There had been at least 7 disappearances from cruise ships operating in the Caribbean during that window, all involving young passengers or staff, all with inconclusive or contradictory outcomes. In 5 of the cases, the vessels had employed short-term subcontractors for maintenance or engineering, many hired through defunct shell companies registered in Panama or Belize. In 2 cases, the name Blue Horizon Services appeared. That was the same firm that had employed Marquez. And in one of those disappearances, a woman named Claire Anselmo, 26, who vanished in 1986 aboard a ship called the MV Emerald Tide. A steward had reported seeing her late at night near a restricted crew stairwell, being followed by an unfamiliar man in a white uniform. The report had been dismissed at the time. No one in uniform was unaccounted for, but the steward's description, the color of the uniform, the man's height, and a noticeable scar over the right eye mirrored the same features seen in the background of Lena's photo. Rourke reopened the Anselmo file. The ship no longer existed. It had been sold, stripped, and renamed twice, but the steward, now living in San Antonio, agreed to an interview. His memory was faded, but when shown the enhanced photo of Marquez from Lena's roll, he paused. "Yeah, I think that's him," he said. He walked weird, heavy steps, didn't talk much. With that, Rourke requested that the Maritime Board of Safety review all crew staffing records, between 1,985 and 1,990 particularly vessels contracted through Blue Horizon or their subsidiaries. The board refused. The data was incomplete, archived inconsistently, and the agency lacked authority over foreign-flagged ships. The door was quietly closed. In the absence of jurisdiction, Rourke compiled her findings into a private memo internally labeled Shadow Crew Hypothesis. It outlined how companies like Blue Horizon operated, hiring non-licensed maintenance staff, rotating them through vessels using short-term contracts, often with minimal background checks and no long-term accountability. It wasn't conspiracy. It was negligence, scaled to an industrial level. And in that negligence, people disappeared. The memo was quietly filed, noted, and archived. Rourke, nearing retirement, left the Bureau in 1999. She never gave interviews, but in a letter sent to both families, she wrote a single line that stuck with Sam Reed for years. The silence around your brother's death was not natural. It was built. In the years that followed, the case of Lena Morris and Tyler Reed faded from national memory, but it never left the households it broke. Jean Morris, now gray-haired and soft-spoken, kept her daughter's wedding dress sealed in a cedar box at the back of her closet. She never opened it. Every few months, she would visit the florist Lena had once worked part-time for just to walk past the roses. She said the smell brought her peace. Harold, for his part, had become quiet. He volunteered at the local library, shelving books and replacing worn barcode stickers. He rarely spoke of Lena, but every time a cruise commercial played on television, he would reach for the remote faster than his reflexes should have allowed. In the Reed family, Sam had tried to move on. He'd gotten married, had a daughter, changed careers twice, but every June, he'd take out the photo, the one of Tyler and Lena standing near that hatch, and stare at it longer than he should. Not looking for something new, just trying to understand what they had felt in that moment. Whether they knew. He later told a friend, "It's not the not knowing that breaks you, it's the knowing but being powerless to prove it." Both families had refused to participate in a proposed television dramatization of the case. The producers had wanted a multi-episode arc, possibly with reenactments. Jean said no. "This isn't entertainment," she told them. "This was my daughter." But the story didn't fully disappear. Online forums began to reference the case, particularly among communities tracking cruise-related vanishings. Some users created timelines. Others speculated on broader networks of maritime crime. A few dismissed the case altogether as a tragic accident, despite the mounting evidence to the contrary. One comment on a now-defunct forum read, "People don't realize how big the ocean island. It hides things, and some of those things are designed to be hidden." In 2001, a small memorial plaque was quietly installed on a public bench overlooking the water in Galveston, the port where Lena and Tyler had first boarded the Palmyra. It reads, "To those who vanish and the love that never does." There's no mention of names, no dates, just silence and waves. Agent Rourke, long retired, was seen once standing by it. She left a single white rose. By 2002, the case of Lena Morris and Tyler Reed had become a teaching tool, not in public forums or press releases, but behind closed doors, in FBI briefings and internal maritime safety seminars. It was presented not as a failure of law enforcement, but as a cautionary tale of jurisdictional gray zones, contractual loopholes, and systems designed to be just fragmented enough to escape accountability. Within the Maritime Safety Advisory Board, a short case summary was circulated under the title, Case Study 287B, Disappearance on Foreign Flagged Vessel, Unresolved Fatality, Probable Contractor Involvement. It was used during onboarding sessions for junior analysts. A redacted version made its way into the Department of Homeland Security archives when cruise oversight was reassessed post-9/11s. But no one ever spoke of it publicly. There was no report to Congress, no audit of hiring practices, no widespread mandate for reform. When one junior investigator asked why the subcontracting firm responsible Blue Horizon Services was never prosecuted, the answer came flat. The company dissolved before the law caught up. No entity left to charge. No one to serve papers to. Andres Marquez remained a shadow. Interpol had received 2 additional tips in the early 2002, both unverified. One placed him working on a cargo vessel in the Strait of Malacca under the name Diego F. Ramos. The second came from a retired dock worker in Chile, who claimed to have seen a man with a scar and quiet eyes on a rusted fishing trawler in 1997. Neither lead panned out. Fingerprint scans were inconclusive. Surveillance footage didn't exist. The trail remained cold. Meanwhile, cruise lines continued to flourish. By 2005, the global cruise industry had grown by over 60% compared to 1,987. Ships were larger, sleeker, more digital, but many still flew flags of convenience. Liberia, the Bahamas, Panama. Places where staffing regulations were thin, reporting requirements even thinner. A review conducted by an independent watchdog group found that from 1,990 to 2004, more than 100 people had disappeared from cruise ships without formal resolution. Some were confirmed suicides, others likely accidents. But a significant number, over 24, were simply gone. No bodies, no explanation, no answers. And of those, only a fraction resulted in investigations that reached beyond internal cruise security. In 2006, a short op-ed appeared in a maritime law journal. Written under a pseudonym DR, it read, "We map the oceans with GPS, but we still allow our laws to drown in them. A ship is not just a vessel, it's a floating blind spot. Until that changes, disappearances will remain an inevitability, not a mystery." Some believe DR was Dana Rourke. If so, it was the last thing she ever wrote about the case. The final version of the Morris Reed case file, now marked "Closed with Extraordinary Circumstance," was archived in 2007 the FBI's Behavioral and Investigative Support Unit. A copy was also submitted to the National Center for Missing Adults. Neither included the last photo. That image, Lena and Tyler, standing near the hatch, remained classified. But among agents who had seen it, one detail lingered. The clock on the wall behind them, barely visible, skewed by glare, read 11:49 p.m., 1 minute before the hatch was opened. 1 minute before the ocean claimed everything. In the spring of 2009, more than 2 decades after the disappearance, the case was unexpectedly jolted back to life, not by new evidence, but by a voice that had been silent all those years. A man named Felix Duran, a former kitchen porter on the MV Palmera, came forward through a legal aid organization in Costa Rica. He was 64 years old, diabetic, living alone in Punta Arenas. He'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and, according to his intake interview, had something he needed to put right. His story began like most crew testimonies, quiet, unremarkable. He remembered Lena and Tyler, said they looked happy, said he once handed them folded napkins at the buffet. But then, without being prompted, he said something else. That night, I heard something. I saw something. He described the corridor behind the kitchen galley, a metal service tunnel that led toward deck C's ventilation units. The area was strictly off-limits to passengers and rarely used by non-engineering crew. Around 11:30 p.m., while taking trash out through the back route, Felix claimed he heard voices arguing in English. 2 men, 1 woman. He paused when describing the tone. The woman was scared, not screaming, just repeating herself over and over. Something like, "We're not supposed to be here." Felix said he stopped near a storage hatch and listened. The voices were coming from just beyond a half-closed utility door. He didn't look, he didn't speak. But he remembered one specific thing, the voice that responded to her. Deep, flat, with an accent. And one word he repeated, quiet. Felix didn't report it. He didn't dare. As a contracted kitchen worker, he wasn't part of the formal crew. He had no union, no protections. Speaking out meant losing his only income, and he wasn't even supposed to be on that deck. But that wasn't all. Felix also remembered the face. He claimed that just before the door swung shut, he saw a man in a white uniform with no visible name tag, pushing a cart with what looked like bundled canvas on it. When shown a digitally enhanced image of Andres Marquez, Felix stared at it for a long time. Then, he simply nodded. Yes, that's him. That's the one who said quiet. The FBI reopened the internal file, adding Felix's statement as an unverified testimonial. He passed a voluntary polygraph, though the results, like all polygraphs, were inadmissible in court. Still, agent notes indicated a high degree of consistency with prior findings, but nothing else could be done. Felix died 4 months later. His statement was archived. No other crew member could corroborate what he had heard. Even so, the testimony marked a chilling milestone. For the first time, someone had heard what happened that night. The implication was no longer just circumstantial. Lena and Tyler hadn't fallen. They hadn't wandered. They had been confronted, and someone had been trying to silence them, literally. After Felix Duran's testimony, there was a renewed sense of weight behind the case, but not momentum. The FBI's legal reach was still limited by time, geography, and the fact that no formal criminal charges had ever been filed. Marquez remained a name, a face, a ghost. His last verifiable record, the faded crew card recovered from the sea, was dated June 1987. Nothing since. What lingered wasn't a question of what happened. It was the growing understanding that someone could have stopped it. In internal reviews conducted in 2010, an ethics subcommittee within the Maritime Safety Council re-examined a previously overlooked document. A confidential incident report submitted to Blue Horizon Services in May 1987, just 1 month before the MV Palmera departed, with Lena and Tyler on board. The report described a complaint made by a crew member on a different ship, the MV Lyria Bell, about a maintenance contractor named A. Marquez. The complaint, written in Spanish, stated that the contractor had been found loitering in a restricted passenger area, making passengers uncomfortable, and had twice been asked to vacate sections where no maintenance was scheduled. The officer filing the report noted that Marquez lacked official clearance and requested his immediate removal. The report was marked reviewed, but the final line scribbled in pencil, faint and almost illegible red. Transferred to Palmera, Deck C, rotation the 14th of June. Not fired, not removed, transferred. That discovery sent a wave of nausea through the office reviewing the file. Whoever had reviewed that internal complaint had not only ignored the warning, they had placed Marquez on a ship with fewer security protocols and more autonomy. Why? It was a question no one wanted to answer. Blue Horizon Services no longer existed. The officer who signed off on the transfer had retired in 1998. His forwarding address in the Canary Islands led nowhere. The remaining archives were incomplete, scattered, and in some cases outright lost. But the system had moved him. They'd had a chance, and they didn't act. Back in Arizona, Sam Reed was the only family member who chose to stay involved in the latest round of disclosures. He was given access to the updated timeline, the internal memos, even the scribbled transfer order. He read them all, then sat in silence for a long time. "You always want to believe there was nothing that could have been done," he later told a journalist. "But now I know there was. Someone saw him, someone warned them, someone moved him anyway. That's not mystery, that's permission." No charges were filed, no names released. The Morris family didn't speak publicly. Gene Morris stopped returning calls from the Bureau entirely. But in May 2011, an article was quietly published in the American Maritime Review, written by an anonymous former cruise safety consultant. The final paragraph read, "Ships are built to keep people in, but it's time we talk about how easy they make it to make people disappear." By 2012, the name Palmera had nearly vanished from the public record, replaced by rebranded vessels, new cruise lines, and different disasters. What had once been a haunting mystery had become, in the words of one editor, an archival curiosity. But online, the case refused to stay quiet. Bloggers and amateur sleuths began circulating alternate theories. Some proposed that Lena and Tyler had staged their own disappearance. Others claimed they had fallen in love with a crew member and fled. A few darker corners of the internet speculated about organ trafficking, deep-sea cults, or government cover-ups. None of these ideas were supported by evidence. But facts rarely matter once the narrative starts to slip. In 2014, a popular documentary streaming platform aired a sensationalized docuseries titled Overboard: The Lovers Who Vanished. The episode about Lena and Tyler was framed around dramatized reenactments, eerie music, and rhetorical questions posed by a voiceover narrator who never once mentioned the name Andres Marquez. Instead, the show focused on the photo of the couple, the one taken just before they vanished, presenting it as ambiguous and open to interpretation. Body language experts were brought in to speculate. One suggested Lena looked troubled. Another said Tyler was protective, but distant. The hatch behind them, clearly open in the original photo, was digitally blurred in the episode, allegedly for editorial consistency. Sam Reed refused to participate. So did Jean Morris. The producers contacted Agent Rourke, now fully retired. She declined. But in a private email to Sam, she wrote, "If they won't tell the story right, then it's not worth telling at all." Despite the distortion, the episode revived public interest. Reddit threads reignited. YouTube creators produced explainer videos and countdowns of unsolved cruise disappearances. Once again, Lena and Tyler were names people whispered into algorithms. But the version being passed around bore little resemblance to reality. The man at the center of it, the one with the scar, the silence, the keys, was almost always absent. One independent journalist, Claire Rowan, attempted to correct the record. She published a 6-part investigative blog called The Corridor, piecing together the full known timeline, including Marquez's connection, the recovered artifacts, and the recovered testimony. Her work was meticulous, citing only confirmed sources, never leaning on rumor. But it gained only moderate attention. A comment left under the first part read, "Interesting, but too boring. Not enough drama." Another simply said, "Sounds fake." Claire shut the series down after part 6. In a final postscript, she wrote, "Maybe this is what happens when you solve a mystery in pieces. By the time the truth is found, no one wants it anymore." In a way, the media had done what the sea could not. It drowned Lena and Tyler again, but this time in half-truths, ambiguity, and cinematic fiction. Meanwhile, the real photo, the one with the open hatch, the bent railing, the nervous eyes remained locked in an FBI archive. Still time-stamped, still silent, still real. Long after the headlines faded and the algorithms moved on, the Morris Reed case remained where it had always been, in the margins of institutional memory. Not forgotten, just unspoken. Within the FBI, a few younger analysts had heard of the case through rumors: the photo that was too real, the hatch that led nowhere, the killer who was never charged. Some viewed it as a cautionary tale. Others saw it as a failure. But those who had touched the case directly, they carried something heavier. Agent Dana Rourke, retired for over a decade by then, rarely discussed her time in the Bureau. She lived alone in a quiet part of Maine, her name absent from lectures, her face never featured in true crime specials. But in 2015, during an off-the-record roundtable with a small group of law students, she shared a moment that had stayed with her since the early years of the case. She spoke about the night she first saw the full set of recovered photos, the roll from Lena's camera. "It was a strange thing," she said. "You don't usually get a person's last minutes captured like that. One moment they're having dinner, the next they're standing at the edge of something they don't understand." When asked if she believed Marquez had acted alone, she was silent for a while before answering. "I think someone let him act. That's not the same as acting alone." Her words were later paraphrased in a thesis on maritime liability, but never attributed. Her voice remained unofficial, a whisper beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Isaac Benitez, the coral-eyed drone operator who first spotted the white sneaker beneath the coral ledge, left salvage work 2 years later. In an interview for an unrelated deep-sea documentary, he was asked what the most difficult recovery of his life had been. He didn't hesitate. The one where we only found the pieces. He never mentioned names. He didn't need to. Back in Arizona, Jean Morris began writing longhand letters to her daughter, not to send, but to fold and place inside a locked drawer in her bedroom. Every June, she'd write a new one. Some were only a few lines. Others ran pages. No one read them. And Sam, still carrying the photo, eventually stopped trying to correct people online. The comments got worse. The details got blurred. And each time he saw a version of the story twisted, he had to decide again. Fight or let it go. Eventually, he chose quiet. In a private email to Claire Rowan, the journalist who tried to tell the story properly, he wrote, "I used to think the worst part was not knowing, but now I think it's watching everyone forget, watching people fill the gaps with nonsense, when the truth was enough on its own." He ended the message with a single sentence. "I just don't want her to become entertainment." But that was already happening. Because stories don't disappear anymore. They fragment, they echo. And somewhere between silence and spectacle, the truth gets caught in the current, carried far from where it began. Like a duffel bag on a stormy beach, or a shoe beneath the sea. In 2017, on the 30th anniversary of Lena and Tyler's disappearance, a small article appeared in a local Arizona paper. It wasn't an investigation, not an expose, just a human interest piece. The headline read, "Still, Waiting, a mother's memory of a honeymoon that never returned." The author had interviewed Jean Morris in her modest Tucson home, surrounded by plants and old framed photographs. She declined to be photographed herself. She didn't want pity. She just wanted to speak. She talked about the first days after the disappearance, the phone call, the confusion, the waiting. She talked about how the cruise line had sent a polite letter in a fruit basket. She remembered how Lena always double knotted her shoelaces and carried ginger candy in her bag for nausea. Small things, human things. The interviewer asked her if she believed justice had been done. She laughed, kindly. "Justice isn't a word I use much anymore," she said. Justice would have meant they came home. Or someone told us the truth when we asked for it the first time. Justice isn't quiet. This was all too quiet. At the end of the article, John mentioned she still lit 2 candles every the 20th of June. One for Lena, one for Tyler. But there was a third item she added recently, a smooth stone, sea-worn and gray, recovered from a trip to Isla de la Juventud 5 years earlier. She kept it on the mantle beside the photo. "It's just a rock," she said, "but it was in the water, maybe close to them. That means something." That same year, a Freedom of Information request was submitted by a journalist trying to obtain the sealed photo, the one of Lena and Tyler in the corridor. The request was denied. The official reason cited, ongoing sensitivity to surviving family members and potential future legal proceedings. There would be no future legal proceedings. The FBI file remains closed, archived under a subdirectory titled Maritime Casework, Unresolved Homicides, 1982nd, Restricted. The case ID still exists, the inventory list intact. The physical evidence, the shoe, the earring, the duffel bag, the broken lens stored in temperature-controlled lockers somewhere in Virginia. But no one is reviewing it. It now lives in boxes, in tags, in metadata, and in the memories of a few people who can still remember the names. In 2020, Sam Reed returned to Galveston for the first time in over 2 decades. He didn't tell anyone, just walked along the port where the Palmera once docked. Most of the buildings were new, the signs modern, but the pier still curved the same way. He sat on the memorial bench. He read the words again, "To those who vanish and the love that never does." He stayed there until the sun dipped below the horizon. Then he stood, and without ceremony, without camera, without even a word, he took Lena and Tyler's photo out of his wallet, and he left it there. In the years that followed, Lena and Tyler's names rarely appeared in official reports, but their story left fingerprints across the maritime world, quiet, bureaucratic, and largely invisible. In 2021, the International Cruise Safety Accord passed a new clause requiring enhanced identity tracking for all contracted workers on vessels entering U.S. waters. Clause 17B was dry, technical, a paragraph buried in a 300-page document, but at the very bottom of the amendment, a footnote appeared. Recommendation informed by case documentation. U.S. FBI case file number 874. Closed 1997. No names, no details, but the reference was unmistakable. For those who had read the internal memos, who had seen the timeline, who had followed the trail from the open hatch to the ocean floor, it was a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone wrong and that it had left a scar deep enough to move policy. And yet, in practice, little changed. Subcontracting remained the norm. Background checks were still inconsistent across flags of convenience. Cruise lines continued to operate under fragmented jurisdictions that made enforcement difficult and accountability rare. The system learned just enough to protect itself, not to fix itself. One former investigator called it institutional amnesia by design. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of legal and psychological literature, the Morris Reed case found new life as a case study in ambiguous loss, a term coined for situations where death is certain, but the body is never found. It described the grief that never fully arrives, because there's always a gap, a pause, a what if. A professor at the University of Washington, Dr. Clara Spector, began including the case in her trauma and memory course. Not for the crime, but for the aftermath. She would tell her students, some wounds don't scar, they stay open. Not bleeding, just waiting for something that never comes. In a small academic journal, she later wrote, "The story of Lena and Tyler is not just about what was done to them, it's about what wasn't done around them. Not just who committed the act, but who stayed silent, and who moved them out of sight when they could have pulled them back." The photo, the one from the corridor, was still sealed in a government archive, but a handful of training analysts had seen it during internal seminars. One of them, under anonymity, later posted a reflection to an internal law enforcement forum. It read, "They weren't running. They weren't lost. They were right there, standing still. It was the rest of us who moved around them and pretended not to see." The post was up for a few days, then quietly removed. It didn't matter. The people who needed to see it already had. Because the lesson had always been clear, not in bold, but in the quiet margins of a file that almost no one wanted to read. There are no endings in cases like this. Only places where the trail thins, and memory has to do the rest. In 2022, the FBI's internal system flagged the Morris Reed file as inactive, preserved for historical reference. The evidence was not destroyed. Too many eyes had touched it. Too many boxes had been checked to let it vanish now, but it was moved to deep storage with no scheduled review. A closed case in the truest bureaucratic sense. Unresolved, unprosecuted, unforgettable. Jean Morris passed away quietly that winter. Her obituary made no mention of Lena, not because she was forgotten, but because she never needed to be named. Everyone who knew Jean already knew who she had lost. At the memorial, Sam placed a copy of Lena's wedding photo on the table beside the guest book. He didn't explain it. No one asked. The picture faded, warm, ordinary spoke for itself. In the final years of his life, Sam began donating to maritime advocacy groups. He never attached his name. One of the organizations, a startup focused on safety reform aboard commercial cruise vessels, received a handwritten letter in 2023 that read, "My family didn't get justice, but maybe someone else can get a warning." The letter was signed with only 2 initials, Sac. And somewhere, deep in the archive vaults of Virginia, still stored in temperature-controlled boxes, are the remains of a decade-long story. A shoe, a lens, a bent earring, a waterproof pouch, and a photograph. The photograph, the one of Lena and Tyler in the corridor eyes unshore, Shoulders closed, the open hatch yawning behind them. A moment caught not for drama or proof, but by accident. A final attempt at memory. Maybe they took it because something felt wrong. Maybe they wanted a timestamp. Maybe it was just reflex. But in the end, that image became everything. Not because it solved the case. Not because it led to prosecution, but because it made them real. When stories fade into mystery, the danger is that we let go of the people inside them. We turn them into questions, into tropes, into disappearance, instead of presence. But Lena Morris existed. Tyler Reed existed. They were young, in love, excited, vulnerable, and then someone opened a door. And then they were gone. But not completely. Not in the photo. Not in the archive. Not in the candles lit every June. Not in the bench that looks out over the water. They didn't vanish. They were taken. And even now, the ocean holds their memory not as a grave, but as a mirror. Still, deep, waiting to be understood.